Hello and welcome to the presentation. I'm Alexia, and this project aims to interrogate whether architecture can serve the role of advocating agent, and thus catalyst, for transformation towards resilient systemic health and ultimately dignity in Malusi. This presentation comprises the individual work undertaken from week 4 to 6, as informed by the preceding 3 weeks of group research, of which I was in group 3. This presentation is also loosely structured as a narrative of the process undertaken, which in its entirety can be understood in terms of a theoretical framework, a contextual framework, the resulting spatial and systematic response, and the critical reflection. The theoretical framework, first part, can be further split into the normative lens, such as an ecological or phenomenological paradigm, and the general knowledge or principles of climate change. But for now, we will begin with the critical position, which tells us that change begins with critically assessing how you see the world, in understanding your own role and realizing that the importance of any system lies in its relationships and not our normative conceptions of static outcomes or objects. In order to participate intentionally and beneficially, one needs to understand our living partnership with the world around us as relational and not transactional. This suggests that the way we should be approaching climate change problems is the same way we should be approaching so many other social and economic issues, as our fundamental conception of the relationship between what is inside versus what is outside of us, the other, is currently unhealthily fixated within the binary. Understanding place and its existing potential, whilst improving the value of existing systems, or manifesting, is a way to address climate change without imposing inappropriate technological systems in an effort to preserve current conditions against time's uncertainty. This brings us full circle to how we see the world, and whether we impose change or strive to reconcile our relationship with it. In light of this, the intentions are as follows. 1. To explore climate change adaptation and regenerative design as a design generating method. 2. To showcase appropriate context-specific spatial and technological analysis and responses, and 3, to measure potential of architecture as an advocating agent and catalyst for systemic transformation. In terms of methodology, the process, this following process was followed and will be further elaborated on during the remaining parts of the presentation, which is part B, C, and D. In terms of part B, this section will introduce the remaining portion of the theoretical frameworks as well as the contextual frameworks using this incremental sequence that was followed whilst undertaking the research. The risks relating to climate change are as social as they are environmental and essentially threaten our human dignity as well as other core human rights as upheld by our Constitution. This project will thus consider the important relationship between adaptation and human dignity going forward. It is also important to note that the research area, Malusi, is a sprawling informal neighborhood or settlement located to the west of Pretoria CBD in City of Tshwane Region 3. This exposes it to the climate hazards faced by Tshwane and the majority of South Africa, being rainfall variability, high temperatures, and extreme weather events. Furthermore, Malusi is an informal settlement, and just as with other informal settlements studied within Pretoria this year, is undergoing rapid growth in light of increasing trends of urbanization. Thus, informal settlements typically have a worrying social vulnerability index due to the existing infrastructural deficit. And this is important because it increases Malusi's exposure to the identified climate change hazards previously mentioned, suggesting a need to provide basic infrastructure as part of climate adaptation measures. This is a suggested site for the project, a central point between Malusi 1, 2, and 3, and was suggested by the main client brief, which indicates a need for a health and a research post. Furthermore, interviews with community health worker residents emphasize the need for basic service infrastructure in Malusi. It was then imperative that we undertook a vulnerability mapping exercise in order to understand the particular climate adaptation needs of Malusi. And this began with the group desktop mapping of existing sensitivities, which then led to a greater understanding of the relationships between each sensitivity and impact. It also assisted in identifying existing leverage points that support successful contextual adaptation, the adaptive sensitivities. This project will focus on addressing climate change sensitivity, human health issues, water shortage impacts, and infrastructural damage impacts by leveraging access to clean water, access to sanitation infrastructure, and healthcare through essentially the provision of this infrastructure, but also its versatile and adaptive technology so that resilience can be fostered. Now, having identified or defined the climate adaptation strategy out of the theoretical and contextual frameworks, this section, section C, will explore place on a site-specific scale in order to inform the role of the project and the user technology interface so that we may arrive at a spatial and systematic response. So this began with the site selection and analysis, which indicated a few things, specifically drainage issues due to deep dips in the topography and also it being at the foot of a ridge, the high velocity of rainwater surface runoff. It also indicated a need for additional shading, as well as an opportunity to define a more comfortable street edge condition. It's a very wide existing street. The site sits on an important transport corridor for Malusi and thus serves a considerable portion of the people, specifically in terms of these more public programmed buildings over here, for example, the creches across the road. Alongside interview data, which you can see over here has informed the understandings of patterns of interaction and essence patterns, told us that migration and informality and affordability and simplicity are important patterns, as are community and unity. The essence patterns is defined or identified as stabilizing social network. This is through the interview feedback, which indicated that people really support one another. And this supports the importance of architecture's role being that of a facilitator of systemic social change towards environmental stewardship, where architecture is the boundary condition or temporary nexus in the flow that reflects positive ecological worldview. In order to foster environmental stewardship or to dwell, it is imperative that the response embodies the existing potential of Malusi. In order to catalyze systemic transformation, it is furthermore important that the architecture makes existing strong relational connections within Malusi visible. This project thus has the opportunity to define a positive interface between the community needs, the clinic needs, and the climate adaptation needs, strengthened by a research and connectivity node. There also exists the opportunity to apply strategies researched in quarter 1 and 2 within the context of plastic view and cemetery view that can be applied to Malusi. In terms of sanitation, this would include the plugging in of vermicomposting sanitation approaches, which can be accommodated easily by the adaptable ablution prototype shown in this GIF that I worked on last quarter. In terms of access to water, this would include rainwater collection, as well as grey water filtration using the upflow-downflow siliceous system, as well as introducing water filtration channels on the ground to mitigate existing drainage issues. It is also important to remember that in terms of climate change adaptation and human dignity, it's not only the provision of basic services that are important, but also the experience and the spatial conditions. So the approach also needs to take into consideration thermal comfort, as well as safety and belonging. Here's a preliminary spatial and systematic principle that was explored for a multi-service node. In terms of further response to site conditions, an important consideration, once again, was the steep slopes, which will be made use of. It is suggested that, furthermore, that an artificial wetland is implemented in this area as well to mitigate and slow down the surface runoff, which naturally collects there. In terms of a precedent study, Casahilo is a project which forms part of the Apan Housing Laboratory in Mexico, and it became a helpful construction informant because it also aims to facilitate incremental expansion through a modular framework and offers the opportunity for adaptable wall infill. This GIF shows an overall impression of the subsequent massing exercise undertaken according to the principles and program outlined. Over here we can see the water siliceous upflow downflow system coming into shape. Over here you will see the ablutions coming into shape. In fact, let's go to this next slide where we can see this is where the health node will sit, the research node and the community node, which all function together in this way. The ground floor accommodating storage area, which will serve both the health node and the research node. The ground floor being the main community interface as well as the health services interface, and the first floor being the more private areas such as the safe house or overnight areas, the breakaway areas for studying for the staff, as well as the area that houses the equipment for research that keeps it safe. Finally, we landed an exploration of the possible spatial and systematic response within the modular framework that was undertaken. Once again, these are actually the multi-service nodes that are being suggested that can be explored at a later stage. Important to note here is the fact that we have a community center that can be plugged in over here, and a shipping container or that can be plugged in here as just like the existing health node. The whole point of this is to provide shading as well as infrastructure to allow for the easy adaptation and expansion, as well as accommodate healthy service provision. Over here, once again, the health node, the research node, the community node, suggested wetland, and future transferable service nodes, with all of the access points over here, as well as an internal courtyard, which is a waiting area for the health node, and this area, which is pretty much a waiting area for the community node, where one can relax. And over here, obviously, the ablutions that plug in. Once again, the upflow downflow siliceous approach to greywater filtration makes use of gravity and uses the slope to its advantage, where one can drop off their greywater and collect their filtered water on the side, which can help with the washing of buckets before water is filled at this municipal serviced water tank. Over here we have our greywater, our vermicomposting toilets, and once again trying our very best to allow for rainwater collection so that this node over here can function as hand washing for the ablutions, as well as the community center, as well as this area here for the staff and the community. So once again, one can enter here for the health node. This is your community health center, which plugs into this more permanent infrastructure, which provides sanitation and water. This is a more emergency area here that can be accessed directly, and this is another more intimate waiting area. This is multi-purpose, can be used for the social workers, for the maternity consultations, and this is actually your reception area. This area over here is your research node, which is very important that it is placed in this interface with the community as well as with the vermicomposting, because it's important that that is closely monitored for health reasons. And this is a breakaway space for the medical staff or the community health workers, where there is a kitchen that where they can leave their things, and also with an access route which makes access quite easy and access to the storage quite easy as well. Then on the second floor, once again, this is the safe house / overnight. This is the floor above where the research node is. This is where the research equipment will be kept, and this is an area for the community health workers to come and have some quiet reading, studying time. And then just showing the spatial conditions of each facade, which were modeled just according to heat gain as well as lighting, and finally, overall, in terms of critical reflection, the spatial and systematic framework yielded from this project has resulted in exciting and generous spatial qualities as it wishes to facilitate dignity, which transcends just human needs, basic needs. At this point, I believe that perhaps the contextual appropriateness of the steel and concrete used within the more permanent framework infrastructure can perhaps be further questioned going into the next quarter. But all in all, the most successful aspect of this project is perhaps its role as an advocate, because the process has definitely impacted on my own understanding of the world around me, and thus my own approach as an architect. So for this reason, I believe there's much potential in continuing the exploration of architecture and advocacy into the next quarter. Thank you.